Welcome back to Research Design Build. In today's episode, I'm going to show you how I built this great big kids bed out of 3 sheets of plywood. Now this may look like a jumbo sized crib, and right now that's basically what it is. It's a twin bed with full height railings all the way around it like you'd have on a crib. The idea with the design was to allow the bed to kind of grow with my kid. And so what I've done here on the front is this one section of the railing, last sort of 20 inches or so, is removable. As she gets a little bit older and isn't playing escape, then we can unbolt this section, take it out, and it's still providing her some protection so she's not rolling out of bed, but she can get in and out of bed by herself. And later down the road, when she doesn't need any more, we can remove all of these railings. And as a final step, if she does outgrow the mini house kind of look, then that also too can be removed, and then we're just left with the platform base. Now when you're designing kids furniture and building kids furniture, safety is of utmost importance, and luckily there's some really good guidelines online that I was able to find. I'll put a link in the description below, and those cover things like, you know, what should the height be from the top of the mattress to the top here, as well as what the maximum spacing is in between these rungs. Once I'd finalized the design, I found that I was able to build this all out of 3 sheets of plywood. Now with that, I had to do some shopping around because there's a wide range right now in terms of cost for plywood. But I was able to find this product at Lowe's, which was a 3/4 inch plywood that they had in 4x8 sheets that has a maple veneer on it. Now this is definitely a cheaper grade of maple veneered plywood. There are some voids in it, and the veneer is super thin. When I compared it to some other maple plywoods that are definitely a lot better, it was about half the price. And for this type of project where, you know, I don't know how long my kid's going to be using it before we need to sell it or dismantle it or repurpose it, I was much more comfortable spending $300 on plywood versus spending $600 on plywood or over $1,000 for hardwood lumber. So there's the 3 sections of this build, and I started by building the base, which is essentially just 4x4 box sections, and that covers all 4 sides of the bed. Now the sort of uprights and house portion of the bed build are all made of 3/4 inch plywood, 3 pieces laminated together. The third part of the project was all of these railings and a whole ton of these little banisters. The first part of this project is going to be making the bed rails along the sides and front and back of the bed. Now for those are going to be 4-inch box sections. So the first step is to rip all 4 pieces you need to make up the one box section. I'm going to be ripping those at a 45-degree miter cut, and then using the sort of tape method to glue and secure those together as they cure to make that box section that is going to look like one solid piece of maple. I am using a track saw for this. I would not use pretty much any other method to cut these to get those 45s just perfect. A normal skill saw is not going to cut it in this case. You might be able to get the 45, but to be able to make a really long rip cut and maintain the thickness of each piece is going to be very difficult. Now you could do this on a table saw, however with the length that we're looking at here, again that might be challenging, so the track saw is really the ticket. Getting really nice tight miters, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One, if you can actually set your saw at slightly over 45 degrees, that will make sure that the tips have the most pressure on them. And if it's open a little bit on the inside, you're not going to see that, so that's less of an issue. The second tip is that I'm using something like this to mark every single piece. And once this is set for the first board, and I've got this set at 4 inches, I'm leaving this. I'm not adjusting it, I'm not using it for anything else other than measuring each piece until I'm done these cuts. And that will ensure that I've got the track set at the exact same spot for every single board, so that every single piece that I rip is the exact same width. The next part to getting the perfect miter on these rips is that you've got everything set up so it's all perfectly flat. So you want to make sure that your track is perfectly flat with the piece. Now because we're only ripping 4-inch sections here, and this track is, 7 inches wide, you aren't going to have enough stability just on its own in that 4 inches, and you can get a little bit of wobble with the saw, which is going to cause you to have some variability in that 45-degree miter. What I'm using is one of the offcut pieces here to actually support the full track. So I've got 2 tracks here linked together, and when I set that down on my marks, it's supported partially on the piece that I'm cutting and partially on this offcut, which is the exact same thickness as the main piece. And that allows my track to stay perfectly flat and even with the finished piece that I'm going to be ripping, which ensures that that angle is just over 45 degrees. With the 4 pieces, it is now time to start the glue up. We're going to start lining up the boards as closely as we can with the outside surface of the beam. And I have cut these 1/2 inch longer than I need them, so I'll trim them to finished length when I'm done. But just trying to get these as close as possible. And then we're going to use regular packing tape, and the first we're going to go right across, and this is so that when we fold it into the box shape, then we'll be in really good shape as far as getting a nice crisp edge. When you are taping these, what you're trying to do is get that seam, those 45s touching. And then I'll cut the tape a little bit long, and this is going to help us right when we do that final glue up. We'll be able to pull that last piece around and really tighten it up. And now we're going to run 3 pieces of tape lengthways down across that joint, and this will just help with glue squeeze out as well as reinforce that joint a little bit more. All right, with it all taped up, then we can lift it up and spin it around. That didn't work. All right, second time's the charm. And now we'll apply the glue to all of the joints here, and then we'll fold it up and make that box beam. Now this is by far the most satisfying part of this build. Once you get these 3 little blocks here that I had cut just to make sure that everything stayed nice and square, folding it up and folding over the last little piece of tape here to close up the box really is satisfying and very easy to get nice tight miter. After scraping off the remaining glue and a quick sand, these things were looking great. I went back to the miter saw to trim them for length, and then I had to finish off and cap off the ends. You can do this in a lot of different ways, but I decided to use some scrap plywood and cut them with a 45-degree miter on both sides, and was able to kind of complete the pattern, if you will, on the ends that were going to be visible. For the center square, I did grab a piece of solid maple and cut it with a slight taper so that it was kind of looking, almost working like a cork, and I could just tap it in the rest of the way and sand everything flush. Now that I've got the beams made up here, is using some scrap wood to create the supports that will hold up the plywood, which will in turn hold up the mattress. At the ends here, I do have some brackets that I'm using that allow you to take apart the bed and make it easy. There's several different variants around. These are just that I had lying around. Now here you can see the full platform bed in its entirety, all assembled in the shop and ready for final sanding and finish. The next step that I moved on to was laminating all of the pieces needed for the top sort of house section of the build. Now the outer pieces of plywood I made sure were full strips, and then for the inner sort of middle piece I used all of the scraps that I had that weren't quite long enough to make the full piece, but it was the best use of material, and really these interior joints you won't see. I used a 23 gauge pin nailer just to secure them together, just lightly until I got them into the clamps. Because I'm clamping multiple pieces together and I don't want them to get glued together, I am using, again, some tape on the one surface so that that veneer doesn't accidentally get glued to the piece next to it. Now I'm making sure that these all have even clamping pressure, and that's why I've got these metal bars in with the clamps. And as you can see, I am tightening them up, going back, laminating another section, and then unloosening the clamps and putting in that next one on. Another satisfying part I always find is scraping off the excess glue that squeezes out, and then after this it'll be ready to go back to the drum sander. Now with all of these pieces for sort of the upper house frame completed, I needed to find a way to join them. Best thing that I found in my shop that I had was this Domino XL. There's a lot of different ways, but for me, because I had the tool available, this is by far the fastest and most secure way of connecting those joints. I did want to reference off the bottom surface, and so I 3D printed this little spacer, which makes sure that the domino was going directly into the center of each one of these pieces. Here I'm gluing up one of the miter joints, which is sort of the more complicated joint in the house structure, and I'm using some of the offcuts that I made when I was cutting these miters in order to provide some flat clamping surfaces for these small clamps. Now with a larger clamp, I'll go and use those little miters and use those as a parallel surface that I can apply pressure for the clamp. Now again, this is with a 30-degree miter, but if you had any other angle, your offcuts would also work. And finally, the third stage of this project was making all of the railings for around the bed and basically turning it into a large crib for the time being. I did fashion this little jig here, which saved a lot of time and made the process of making about 70 of these little banisters a lot quicker. This hasn't been something that I've always done, and is generally something that I kind of struggle with or regret doing after the fact. And I must say that making little jigs here and there to help out especially repetitive cuts not only gives you a better quality product at the end, but also ends up saving you a lot of time. I went and took these back through the drum sander, and that was just to finish off or to start the sanding process on the open side of the plywood. I did not sand the veneer side with a drum sander as it's much too aggressive and the veneer was paper thin. Connect all of these into the railings. I did go back to the drum sander and use it in a less than safe manner to taper the dominoes that I was using to connect it. As you can see, that pointed end is going to pay a substantial dividend when we go to do the final assembly. It makes it a lot easier to get that top bar mounted. So on the bottom section here, I'm using the regular square dominoes, which have just relieved the outside edges slightly, just to make them a little easier to push in. If it was hardwood, I wouldn't be all that worried about using the full-size dominoes, but with the plywood, I didn't want to split it. And as such, I relieved a little bit of material off each side of the domino to make them go in a little easier. I always find the top railing the hardest thing to get installed and all lined up, and that's where the little chamfer that I've put on the top of the dominoes really pays off. Here I'm going to pre-install all the dominoes in the top rail, and I'm going to install it with sort of the square side down and that taper side pointing up. That little taper side, that is going to buy us a little bit of wiggle room as we try to install each of those banisters into the top here. So now I'm putting all of the glue necessary into each one of the banisters, and I'll be ready to install the top rail. Starting at the one end, you'll see that that just buys you a little bit of wiggle room versus installing it without a taper altogether. I have done it the other way, and it is much more time consuming and much more frustrating, I find. So with all of these installed and patted down, then we can kind of head over to the clamps. Now you notice I have a ton of clamps here, and the reason for that is that those top and bottom railings are only 3/4 inches thick. They're just the thickness of the plywood. and so they don't do a really good job of spreading out the load. So that requires a lot more clamps to make sure that we've got even clamping pressure across the whole piece. As well, you'll see that I come back here with a square, and I'm just making sure that as I tighten this down that I haven't accidentally gotten it askew, and I'm gluing this together at an angle. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed making the bed. Hopefully this inspires you to build some furniture for your own family. If you have any questions, please leave them in the description below. And as always, if you like this type of content, there's plenty more on the channel already, so make sure to check through my other builds. There's a whole lot there, from home renovations all the way to some automotive content as well. Until next time, we'll see you later.